Here we have a study in the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism, which is a journal where medical researchers post their findings. This journal is investigating low-carbohydrate diet's effect on arteriogenic dyslipidemia, which is lipid problems, blood lipid problems, LDL, HDL, cholesterol, lipid problems which could cause arteriosclerosis or heart disease. So we're looking at low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet's effect on lipids and heart disease. Let's scroll down and see what they did. Now what they did here was they served different groups of people different diets to see what it did on their blood markers. So let's take a look at the results. Let's first take a look at triglycerides. This graph, we're looking at the changes in triglycerides, which are fat in the blood, versus time. And I brought up the table which shows the different diets for each group of people. Now if you look at this graph, the diet that created the greatest drop in triglycerides was not the low-fat diet. It was the lowest carb plus saturated fat diet. Quite contrary to what our government recommendations are telling us. The low-fat diet actually had the least reduction in triglycerides, and the only reason that it went down is because people were now on a diet, and they are now watching what they ate. They're not eating the standard American crap diet with a bunch of sugar and sweets. Now let's go back and see what happened to the HDL with all these diets. If you look at this graph, the HDL, the good cholesterol, which everybody wants to go up, which diet caused the greatest rise in HDL? It was not the low-fat diet that the government is recommending. It is the low-carbohydrate diet, which is high in fat and higher in saturated fat. That is the diet that caused the greatest rise in the HDL, which is what we want. And now let's look at what actually matters. And that's the size of your LDL particles. I'll discuss this more later, but let's look at what happened to them. In this graph, the vertical axis is the change in LDL particle size diameter. And what you want is your particle size to be big. So you want the change in LDL particle size to be big, to be positive. So the higher on this graph, the better. And I said, I'll discuss all this more later, but look at this graph for a second. The diet that caused the greatest change in diameter of LDL particles is the low-carbohydrate diets with saturated fat, not the low-fat diets. All of these graphs are telling us that science is showing that consuming a low-carbohydrate, higher-fat diet is good for our blood markers. I linked to this and other studies down in the cholesterol resources page, as well as another study that was a review of other studies that incorporate over 300,000 people to see what the effect of fat and saturated fat on heart disease was. See below for yourself, but they concluded that there's no relationship between fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease. Here's a graph from a presentation by Dr. Jeff Volek, who's done 30 years worth of studies on low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets. Here he shows what tends to happen when you go on a low-carb, high-fat diet, in comparison to a low-fat diet that the government recommends. A few things to note. 1, your body fat goes down more on a high-fat diet. 2, your triglycerides go down way more on a low-fat diet. Another thing is your leptin goes down more on a high-fat diet. If you remember what I told you in my video about appetite, what we need to do with leptin is bring leptin volume down. This will make our appetite function properly. And that's what low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets do. One thing in particular I want to point out is the HDL. On a low-carb, high-fat diet, your HDL goes up. But on a low-fat diet, your HDL, the healthy cholesterol, goes down. That's a problem. So what does cause heart disease if none of this does?